Back in the 1960s, a guy washing dishes at a burger joint retired and walked out of there with $170,000. Back then, houses cost about 20 grand, so that dishwasher didn't retire with savings. He retired with 8 houses. Another waitress working in the same restaurant did even better. She hanged her boots with $600,000 in her account. But how exactly these ordinary individuals working in a restaurant accumulated so much money? Well, they were all working under a man who had already invented the double-decker burger 30 years before the Big Mac and hired Stan Lee to write his comic books. But then, he made one decision that ultimately resulted in his company being banned from using its own name. Yes, this is the crazy story of Bob's Big Boy, and we're getting right into it. Chapter 1. The Bun He Cut in 3. Let's start with Bob himself, because none of this lands properly until you understand how close to nothing this guy was starting from. Bob Wien graduated from Glendale High School in 1933, and his classmates voted him most unlikely to succeed, which isn't a line I'm adding for color. That was the actual verdict. His father's furniture business had collapsed in the Depression, and Bob had spent his school years washing dishes in the cafeteria to pay for his own lunch. So he took the only job he could get, washing dishes overnight at a white log coffee shop in Los Angeles, and he started paying attention to how the place ran. He worked up to fry cook, then manager, and then he did the thing that tells you exactly who this guy was. He quit the manager job and went back to washing dishes somewhere else, because he decided he still didn't understand the front of the house. By 1936, he owned exactly one thing worth anything, a DeSoto Roadster that he loved. And if you've ever loved a car, you know exactly what it costs a man to sell one. He sold it for $300, put the money down on a 10-stool hamburger counter in Glendale, borrowed another $50 off his father for meat, and scrubbed the place until it shined. He was 22. And for 6 months it was nothing special, just another counter on just another street. Then one night in early 1937, a customer came in and asked for something different, something not on the menu. And Bob, half as a joke, took a hamburger bun and sliced it into 3 pieces instead of 2, then stacked it up. Bottom bun, a patty, the middle bun, a second patty, the crown, special sauce, and shredded lettuce. Now here's what he'd actually stumbled into, and I'd put this entire encounter up there with the most profitable accidents in the history of food. That thing looked twice the size. It felt twice the size sitting in your hand. And the whole illusion cost him 1 extra slice of bread and 1 thin patty, which is basically nothing. He had figured out how to make a customer feel like they were getting double, while his own costs barely moved. McDonald's wouldn't launch its own version, the Big Mac, until 1967, so Wien beat the biggest chain on earth to the idea by 30 years, by accident, for a guy who just wanted something off menu. Now he needed something to call it, and the name was already in the building, sweeping his floor. Chapter 2. The Kid Who Swept Up for Burgers. Here's a detail I love about this company. That mascot standing in 1,000 parking lots was a real kid, and he never saw a dime from any of it. His name was Richard Woodruff. He was 6 years old, and he used to come into the restaurant and sweep the floors in exchange for a free burger. Round face, big grin, hair slicked back, wearing a pair of droopy overalls. One afternoon, Bob looked over and said, "Hello, big boy," and that was that. The name landed on the kid and the burger in the same week, and before long it was on the restaurant itself. And then the second accident happened, because sitting at that same counter was a Warner Brothers animation artist named Ben Washam. He pulled out a napkin, sketched the kid in checkered overalls holding a burger over his head, traded the drawing for his lunch, and went back to work. That napkin became one of the most recognized characters in the country, while Washam went back to Warner Brothers and spent his career animating Bugs Bunny. Years later, once the little guy was standing outside restaurants from California to Ohio, he admitted to his colleagues that he'd drawn him, and they never let him forget it. "Benny," they told him, "you could have been heir to a hamburger fortune, and instead, you're stuck here drawing rabbits." By 1955, the character had been redrawn and cast in fiberglass, and those statues started going up outside the restaurants. And if you've ever wondered why the big boy you remember doesn't quite match the one your cousin in another state remembers, you are not imagining that. Back in 1951, the Cincinnati franchisee had already redesigned him, switching to striped overalls instead of checkered blonde hair instead of brown, running forward instead of standing still. Collectors actually call them the East Coast Big Boy and the West Coast Big Boy. Sit with that one for a second because it's the entire story in miniature. This is 1951. The company is 14 years old and there are already two different versions of its own mascot walking around America. Nobody thought that was a problem yet. They were too busy building the thing that made the parking lot worth pulling into. And speaking of an idea good enough to pull a whole country off the road, there's a program someone on our team has been curious about called the Billionaire Brain Wave. It's a simple 7-minute audio built around theta brainwave research, the deep focus brain state linked to where big creative ideas come from. You put on headphones once a day, usually with your morning coffee, and that's the whole routine. It's a one-time $39. It comes with bonus guides on money habits and investing basics, and there's a 90-day money-back guarantee. So testing it costs you nothing if it's not for you. If you're watching on your TV, pause and scan the QR code on screen with your phone camera or tap the first link in the description. Now, back to the Empire and a masterstroke you could only see from the driver's seat. Chapter 3. The building designed to stop a car. Now, the second thing Bob did better than anybody had nothing to do with food at all. It had everything to do with the fact that America had stopped walking anywhere. In 1949, a Bob's Big Boy went up at 4211 Riverside Drive in Burbank, put together by a pair of local businessmen and designed by an architect named Wayne McAllister, and what he built there was not really a restaurant. It was a trap. The roof swept out at a dramatic angle over the drive. The front wall of windows curved inward, and out by the road stood a 35-foot neon blade sign in pink and white, angled so that it hit you well before the building did. So what does a building like that actually buy you? It takes a driver who has not decided to eat anything and turns him into a driver who is already braking. You get roughly 3 seconds of a person's attention at speed, and McAllister built something that stretches it to 4. You're doing 60 on Riverside Drive with no intention of stopping, and 90 seconds later, you're in a booth ordering a milkshake. That isn't hospitality, that's engineering. And think about the timing of it. There were roughly 50 million cars and trucks on American roads in 1950, and by 1960 there were more than 70 million. Most restaurants in 1949 were still designed to seat people who had already decided to come in, while Wien was building for people who hadn't decided anything yet and were doing 60 miles an hour when they made up their minds. It worked so well that McAllister and everyone copying him ended up defining the entire look of American roadside dining, all those soaring rooflines and tall signs and walls of glass. Denny's put that same silhouette on practically every highway exit in the country. It pulled in movie stars, too, partly because they could eat in their cars without getting bothered, and Bob Hope became a regular and a friend. In the summer of 1965, the Beatles asked to eat somewhere that felt like a real American diner and got taken to that Burbank Bob's. There's a plaque on the booth today, and fans have stolen it so many times the restaurant just quietly keeps replacing it. Then, in 1992, the owner announced he wanted to bulldoze it for a strip mall, and it took preservation volunteers pushing the state to name it a California Point of Historical Interest to stop him. It's still open today, still serving, 77 years after they built it. The building survived, which turned out to be more than you could say for the company that put it there. Chapter 4. The Dishwasher Who Retired Rich. The third thing they did better than anyone is the part almost nobody has heard, and I'll be honest with you, it's the reason I wanted to make this video at all. Start with the kitchen, because Wien was ruthless about it. Every server was in uniform and properly trained, every cook had one job, and a team of 3 cooks could push 300 big boys out of that kitchen in a single hour. No computers, no conveyor belts, nothing automated anywhere, just a system built so tightly it ran like a production line. But that isn't the part worth remembering. Think about what a restaurant job actually meant in the 1950s. You took it because you needed money that month, the owner assumed you'd be gone within the year, and you assumed the same thing, so the whole arrangement was built on the understanding that nobody ever stays. Bob Wien looked at that arrangement and decided it was stupid. He let his servers keep every cent of their tips, which plenty of operators at the time did not, and he threw in health insurance and flexible hours on top. And then he did the thing that still sounds invented. He directed 20% of the company's profits into an employee pension fund, and the workers themselves contributed absolutely nothing to it. 20% off the top every year, out of a hamburger chain. One dishwasher retired with more than $170,000. One waitress retired with $600,000. And you have to put that against what money did back then, because a new house in America in the mid-60s ran about $20,000. So that man didn't retire with a nest egg. He retired with 8 houses off a dish station. And if you were exceptional, it went further because his best managers got the chance to own their own locations, with the employee-owned restaurants starting to go up in Phoenix in the 1950s. Think about the shape of that. A man who once washed dishes for his own lunch money was now handing entire restaurants to the people washing his. The town liked him enough for it that they made him mayor of Glendale. Then he took all of that goodwill and pointed it straight at children using a comic book written by a man you have definitely heard of. Chapter 5. The burger chain that hired Stan Lee. In 1956, a hamburger chain from Glendale decided to get into the publishing business, and the guy they handed it to went on to build the Marvel Universe. They called it The Adventures of the Big Boy, and it wasn't a coupon flyer or a maze printed on a placemat. It was a real full-color comic book, professionally printed and handed free to every child who walked through the door. Big Boy was the hero, and he had a girlfriend named Dolly and a dog named Nugget. Remember Dolly because she comes back at the end of this in a way you will absolutely not see coming. Production got farmed out to a New York outfit called Timely Comics, which a few years later would rename itself Marvel, and most of the stories in that first run were written by Stan Lee. Yes, that's Stan Lee. Before Spider-Man, before the X-Men, before the Hulk and Thor and Iron Man, the future architect of the biggest storytelling franchise on the planet was writing burger comics for a diner chain in California. The man who commissioned it used to drive out to Lee's house on Long Island to plan the issues, and Lee remembered the job fondly for the rest of his life. And look who else turned up. The art on the first issue came from Bill Everett, who created Namor the Submariner and co-created Daredevil with Lee. Saul Brodsky, later Marvel's production director, worked the middle issues, and Dan DeCarlo, the man who defined the look of Archie Comics, drew some of the later ones. That is not a marketing budget. That's a murderer's row of comic book history, all of it drawing a fiberglass child in overalls. And now, watch the machine work. A family eats on a Saturday, the kid reads his comic in the booth, reads it again in the car, reads it to his brother at home, then lends it to a friend at school, and that friend's father drives everybody out there the following weekend. You cannot buy that. The series ran until 1996, 4 decades and hundreds of issues, one of the longest-running comic books in American history. McDonald's didn't introduce the Happy Meal until 1979. Bob's Big Boy was doing it with Stan Lee 23 years earlier. So that's 4 separate things, every one of them years ahead of the industry. And by 1979, there were over 1,000 restaurants carrying that name, which is right about when the bill came due on a decision Bob had made back when he was still nobody. Chapter 6. The $1-a-year mistake. Here's the heart of the whole thing. Everything you just heard was real, and almost none of it mattered in the end, because of how Bob Wien handled the one asset that costs nothing to protect and everything to lose. Hold him up against the man building the competition for a second, because Ray Kroc ran McDonald's on total control. Fry oil temperature to the degree. Bun dimensions to the millimeter. One name, one menu, one burger in every town in America forever. Bob went the exact opposite direction, and he did it for a reason that made sense at the time. To hold a trademark nationally, you have to actually be national, so he started handing the Big Boy name out to established regional operators. Frisch's in Cincinnati got the burger in 1946, the Elias brothers in Detroit were the first to formally apply, and after that came Shoney's in the Southeast, Eaton Park in Pittsburgh, Kips in Texas, Mark's in Wisconsin, and Elby's in West Virginia. Eventually, there were 34 different names on those buildings, and he barely charged any of them. 1 to 2% of sales, well under what his competitors were taking, and in some cases no franchise fee whatsoever. Eaton Park held its Pittsburgh license for $1 a year. $1 per year for the entire city of Pittsburgh. But the money was never the fatal part. This was. Every single one of those operators put their own name first, so what you got was Frisch's Big Boy, Shoney's Big Boy, Elias Brothers Big Boy, and on top of that, Wien let them change the food. So Frisch's swapped out his sauce for its own tartar sauce. Mark's in Wisconsin sold Kentucky Fried Chicken inside the dining room, right there next to the Big Boy. When Lendy's in Virginia fell out with its franchisor, it renamed the burger the Buddy Boy and replaced the statues with a mascot of its own. And a Pennsylvania operator who lost a lawsuit renamed the sandwich the Big Ben and redecorated his entire chain around Benjamin Franklin. So think about what all of that does to a kid growing up in Cincinnati. He doesn't think of himself as a Big Boy customer at all. He's a Frisch's kid, and that statue out front is just furniture to him, part of the wallpaper. Which means the day Frisch's walks away, that kid doesn't go hunting for another Big Boy. He follows Frisch's out the door and never looks back. Weon had built one of the most recognized characters in America and then let it mean something different in every state it stood in. He made all of his franchisees rich and made himself the least important company in his own system. He never got the chance to fix it either because in 1966 he lost the whole thing over shrimp. Chapter 7. The Shrimp Boat That Sank It. For the record, this empire did not fall to McDonald's. It fell to a side business that almost nobody remembers. Weon had started a shrimp fishing operation specifically to supply his own restaurants with better shrimp than he could buy on the open market. And across 1966 and 1967, that operation lost $3 million. His board of directors had seen enough, and they told him to resign or sell the company. So he sold. In 1967, Marriott bought the entire thing, parent company, and every franchise agreement in the system for $7 million. That's around $68 million today, for a national chain heading toward 1,000 locations. Weon stayed on as a Marriott vice president for a year, sat on the board one more, and then he was out of the business he'd invented at 53. And what Marriott had bought was a problem nobody could fix, because those franchisees weren't junior partners anymore. Several were bigger than the parent company by then. They didn't need the Mascot for anything. What they needed was a clean way out. Shoney's went first and went hard. By April of 1984, it was the largest Big Boy franchisee in existence with 392 restaurants, and it paid $13 million in cash purely to break its contract and drop the name. Read that number again, because it is the entire thesis of this video. $13 million, spent to stop being associated with the brand. Then the rest went. Elby's paid $500,000 to buy its way out 4 months later, and JB's let its franchise expire in 1988 and walked off with 110 restaurants, saying the only thing its $1 million a year fee actually bought was permission to use a statue. Every one of them left with its customers, its buildings, and its regional loyalty, and not a single one of those customers followed the Big Boy name anywhere. Marriott gave up in 1987 and sold the whole operation to the Elias brothers in Michigan, who couldn't stabilize the debt either and filed for bankruptcy in 2000. Bob Wyan never saw that part. He died in 1992 at 77 years old in Newport Beach. Which brings us to what happened last year, and it is almost too perfect. Chapter 8. The company that isn't allowed to be Big Boy. Everything Bob Weon got wrong in the 1950s came due in an Ohio courtroom in 2025, and the result is one of the strangest things I have come across in a long time. Start with the split, because in 2001, coming out of the bankruptcy, the Big Boy trademark was legally divided in two. Frisch's became the permanent owner of the name across most of Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, and part of Tennessee, and the rest of the country went to what's now called Big Boy Restaurant Group in Michigan. Two companies, the same mascot, no shared menu, and no shared future. Then Frisch's fell apart. It sold to a private equity firm in 2015, ending decades of family control. And by 2024, it had shrunk from around 80 restaurants to roughly 30, with landlords evicting locations over more than $4.5 million in unpaid rent. So the Michigan company saw an opening, picked up the leases on those empty buildings, and got ready to reopen them as Big Boys. And Frisch's sued them, and won. So what happens when a company gets legally blocked from using the only name it has? A court ruled that Big Boy could not operate restaurants called Big Boy in Southwest Ohio because a franchisee Bob Weon signed up back in the 1940s owns that name there now, permanently. So here's what they actually did about it. They opened those 6 restaurants under a different name and called them Dolly's Burgers and Shakes. after Big Boy's girlfriend from the comic book Stan Lee wrote in 1956. That is how little was left. The company that owns Big Boy had to dig through a 70-year-old giveaway comic to find a name it was still legally allowed to use. They lasted 7 months, and all 6 closed in October of 2025. Today, the main Big Boy chain runs about 53 restaurants across 5 states, Frisch's has around 30, and Bob's Big Boy itself, the one that started all of this, is down to a handful of locations in Southern California. And then there's the part that really got me. There are 274 Big Boy restaurants operating in Japan right now, owned by a Japanese company doing perfectly well, and they don't even serve the Big Boy hamburger. So there are roughly 5 times more Big Boys in Japan than in the entire United States, and the burger that started all of this isn't on the menu at a single one of them. So look at what this man actually pulled off. He invented the double-decker, built the modern roadside restaurant, turned dishwashers into homeowners, and hired Stan Lee to sell burgers to children, all of it decades ahead of everybody else. And he lost the whole thing anyway because he gave away the one asset you can never rebuild. Not the recipe and not the building. The reason a stranger in another state has any reason to pick you. That 35-foot sign is still lit in Burbank, pink and white, humming over a parking lot on Riverside Drive 77 years later. It has outlasted the company, the founder, the franchisees, and by now the name itself. If stories about the empires that got everything right except the one thing that mattered are what brought you here, subscribe to Global Status, and we'll keep delivering them. See you in the next one.